ladies and gentlemen. It's almost 4 o'clock, so we are on time. It is a real pleasure for me to be here on the occasion of the Festival dell'Economia at the end of May, and I am particularly pleased to be here in this nice room with the presence of so many frescoes.
Devo introdurre il professor AGHION che mi ha pregato di essere veloce e breve senza leggere il proprio curriculum.
Mr. Philippe AGHION, Professor AGHION, he has asked me to be quite brief in my introduction. Suffice it for me to say that he was born in France. He is 50 years old. He is a French professor teaching in the United States, and in particular, at the moment, he is a lecturer at the University of Harvard. He has a very long curriculum indeed. Today, he is going to address us on the following subject, which is a subject particularly relevant to us Italians. And his subject today is the following public policies, and the exact title of this conference is "Do we really need less state intervention in the economics of innovation?" Well, of course, we are anxious to listen to his presentation. You have the floor.
Very bad. I haven't done anything yet. Maybe after the talk you will change your mind. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and you know, in such impressive premises. And I always say when I come to Italy, there is a big difference, you know, between Italy, you know, Trento and Kendall Square. That everything is beautiful here, where there everything is ugly. It's just a contrast between. It's very impressive to be here. So I was asked to talk about innovation-based economies, and I thought it would be fun to discuss, to put some polemic, some controversies in the debate. There is this big question, and we just went through an election in France, which I didn't, my side didn't win. But that question is very much at the heart of most political debates in Europe, is that do we need less government or less state as we enter an innovation-based phase? Okay, so that's, and I will argue that it's not so much less state that we need, but different type of government intervention. So the starting point of this kind of story is that you say, well, you have EU, okay, the Western Europe, particularly, but now with the newcomers, versus the US, and the story is that up to the 1970s, between Second World War and 1970, EU was growing faster than the US. We had less unemployment than the US. And so we seem to have an economic engine which was working well, which was delivering essentially almost full employment, high growth rates, you know, big rate of increase in income standards, in standard of living. And so the system was delivering, okay? And then, starting after the oil shock, the system didn't deliver so well. I mean, growth went down, unemployment went up, and we stopped catching up with the US in terms of our GDP per capita. And since the mid-1990s, the US have been growing faster than we did. It's maybe this year, maybe the first time where we might grow faster than the US, but up to now, since the mid-1990s, the US were growing faster. So there is a kind of reversal. You see, 30 years after World War II, we are doing better than the US, lower unemployment rate, higher rate of growth, and now it seems that it's the other way around. We have more unemployment than the US, and we have less growth than the US. So something is not working with our economic engine. And so what has to be done? And so I was working on a report which we called the Sapir report. It was a report to Prodi. So Prodi is coming tomorrow, and so it was done for it's Prodi who set up a group of people to think about precisely this question: why is it that Europe is not growing as fast as the US? And the main conclusion we came up with is to say, well, you know, Europe had institutions. So I will become more precise what I mean by institutions. which were good for the needs of an economy that was catching up. So what we were busy doing after World War II is to catch up with the US, to, you see, to reconstitute our stock of capital, to imitate more advanced technologies. We had to catch up, and we had good institutions for that, and I will come back to the institutions we had for catching up. But now we are more, we exhausted what we could get from catching up, and now we are more into the business of innovating. And for that, we don't have the right institutions. So now the big debate is how should we change our institutions to trigger growth in Europe? And that's the debate you've had in Italy as well. You know, Berlusconi, Prodi, none of them says that you should keep exactly as you were before, but the way Prodi wants to change things is not the same way as Berlusconi. And in France, the way the left or the center would like to do it may not be exactly the same way as Mr. Sarkozy might be doing it, although he may change along the way. So we are having these debates. We all agree that the animal is sick, the animal has to be operated, but we don't agree exactly on how it should be operated and how we should, you know, put Europe back on a growth path. Okay, in particular, the debate is on the state. Is it just that we should reduce the role of the state and say lower tax, lower size of governments? Is it just about that, or is it something else? And that's what I will try to talk about. I may not be able to go through all the slides, but you know, at least we. So the first idea, is I already mentioned, is that when you are a country which is not very technologically developed, where we are, for example, far behind the US in terms of GDP per capita, that's what I call technology level. So I say that I am very much below the technology frontier. Then imitation is a big source of growth. You see, if I imitate someone much more advanced than me, I can grow much faster. You see, I can make a big leap just by imitating someone who is more advanced. But as I become close to the technology frontier, then the extent to which I can grow just by imitating becomes less and less. And then I need to go into innovation. I really need to innovate. But to innovate, you don't need the same institutions as you do to imitate. So, so this is a table that just shows you that industries that are more frontier, they invest more in R&D. So R&D intensity increases as industries move closer to frontier. So that shows really this table, I will not go into detail, that there is a very close link between being close to the frontier and being very much investing in R&D and innovation. You see, it's the same thing. When you are close to frontier, you are very much into the business of doing R&D and innovating. When you are far below, you are more into the business of imitating, okay? So I don't want to so now the second idea, oh God, so you can't see the, so the thing is not showing. And this is the beginning? Oh my God. Oh, so, okay, so, yeah, it was good. Can you keep it as it was before? I don't want to see my face. It's not interesting. Okay, very good. So basic idea one, imitation matters more for countries, sectors which are not technologically advanced. Innovation matters more for growth for countries, sectors that are close to technology frontier. And here we see that, you know, in fact, it's a table that shows that in fact, industries that are, as they get close to frontier, they invest more in R&D. R&D and frontier is the same thing. You see, it's very much the same thing. So now the second idea is that to imitate and to innovate, you don't need the same kind of institutions. For example, when we were in the business of imitating or accumulating capital, it's fine to have government subsidies. For example, in France, we had a very Colbertist view of the state. You see, we give, we develop, okay, trains, things, you know, planes. And so government subsidies, okay, we had industrial policy. We would say, we should do this, we should do that. We had a plan in France. I don't know about Italy, but we had very much of something of an industrial policy. Limited competition. Competition was very limited in France. And we had also limited labor market flexibility, okay? Those were the institutions. And we had education systems that were mainly emphasizing primary, secondary education. That's enough to imitate. Okay, so those were the institutions of the 30 years after the war, you know, that made us grow fast at that time. But now we need to innovate, and to innovate I will show you that openness is important, entry is important, market flexibility is important, and private finance, in particular venture capital for new innovating firms, is very important, much more than state subsidies, okay? So we need to move toward a more market-oriented society, okay? And so that you can see, so for example, and so the conclusion is that as we become more developed, we need to change our institution in order to sustain growth. We cannot just always keep the same, we have to change. So for example, if you look at openness, so let me just explain to you how this works. You don't have a laser. Okay, but that's no big deal. So if you look here, yes. Oh, I'm seeing the microphone. Okay, so if you look at the graphs here, on the horizontal axis, you have the extent to which countries are close to frontier or far from frontier, so or technologically developed or not developed. So for example, here I just look at, you look at, you look in fact at, so if you are very below, you see, if you are to the left, you are not developed. If you are to the right, you are developed. That's the horizontal axis, okay? The vertical axis show the growth rate. Now, what's interesting is that you can, therefore, this is a kind of cross-country regression, and that gives you a relationship between how close to frontier you are and how fast you grow. So you see that all these lines are decreasing, and that in fact reflects the fact that when an economy is closer to frontier, is more developed, it grows less fast. For example, the tigers grow very fast. China grows extremely fast. But when China will become much more developed down the road, it will not grow at 10% a year. So that's a normal thing. When you become more developed, your rate of growth tends to go down, okay? Because you've caught up to a large extent. But the question is, at which rate does it go down? And that depends very much on what you do. So on the left-hand side, you have, oh God, it's a pity that you don't see, on the left-hand side, yeah, it's a pity that it's not going, that you don't see what's written on the upper part. On the left-hand side, you can read, it's the closed economy. Those are economies that have not very much open up to foreign trade, okay? So economies that have not opened to foreign trade, you see, when they get close to frontier and they've not opened to foreign trade, they go, you see the rate of growth goes down very quickly. You see what I mean? As they become developed, so when they are far from frontier, they grow fast, it's okay. So it's okay to not open up to foreign trade when you are very far from frontier, when you are very much on the left-hand side, you see? But when you move to the right, you see when you don't open up, the line goes down very fast. Whereas the two panels on the right-hand side are those economies which open up. And when you open up, of course your rate of growth decreases a bit as you move closer to the frontier, but it decreases less fast. That means you can preserve growth more. You see, that's the important diagram that you learn. So if you keep your economy close, you see, sorry, I'm coming back. But when you keep your economy close, you see, being close and being a closed economy and technologically advanced, you grow very slow. You see, it's very bad for you. Whereas if you open up, then you can maintain relatively higher rate of growth. Oh, yeah, okay, okay. Right. Yeah, okay, fine. Okay. So that shows that it's very bad. When you are not developed, it's okay to be open or closed. It doesn't make a difference. But when you are technologically developed, it makes a big difference to be open or to be closed. You should be open, okay? So that's what tells you. As a country moves closer to frontier, it becomes more and more important to open up trade, okay? Which is a form of liberalization. We talk about trade liberalization. No big deal if you don't liberalize far below frontier. Big deal if you don't liberalize close to frontier. Okay, now you can look at entry. Entry is not the same thing as trade liberalization. Entry is how many days it takes a firm to be created. Okay, you have these Schleifer and co-authors measures of how many days of administration it takes for a firm to enter. Okay, and what you want to do is that typically in Europe we have very high entry costs compared to US. okay? And so we should reduce entry cost. So now if you look, we have exactly the same picture as with openness. On the left-hand side, the two panels on the left-hand side are countries which are not reduced, which have high entry barriers. It's countries where it's very costly and time-consuming to create a new firm. And you see that in those countries, it's very bad for growth as you approach the frontier. You see? You can see that the line goes down quickly, you see? Whereas on the right-hand side, you have those countries with low entry barriers. And those, it's fine for entry, it's fine for growth when they are close to frontier. You see what I mean? They maintain, the rate of growth doesn't go down by as much as you become more developed, because you have, in fact, opened up, you have reduced entry barriers. So again, the conclusion is, no big deal to have entry barriers when you are far from frontier, but big deal to have entry barriers when you are close to frontier, okay? So all those things tell you, well, you should liberalize. So you look like a liberal economy, like a Chicago, say, you know, liberalize, liberalize, liberalize. What European countries should do is to yeah, thank you. What European countries should do is to liberalize trade, liberalize entry, and that's it, and that's what you need to do. We should be pure liberals, okay? And that would suggest, you would tell me, well, when you are telling us, sir, is that you should reduce the state, have the state move out, and just liberalize, and off we go, okay? And I want to argue that, in fact, a closer look at the data suggests that, in fact, it's not true. We don't want to reduce the role of the state. We want to just modify the role of the state, okay? And that's the view I want to define here. So, so far, let's look at the R&D policy. Of course, there is one thing you can do, is to say, of course, you want to trigger, to foster innovation and R&D investment. First thing you will do is to subsidize R&D investment or to reduce tax for enterprises who innovate. But I will tell you something, that's not the most important policy. I mean, we may want to have R&D policies, and I think it's important, but it's just one aspect. It's not the most important. You see, if it was, some people believed at some point that R&D was like a magic powder, okay? You put R&D subsidies, and you do like this, and then you make grow, you see, like plants that grow fast, you see, because just you put the R&D. It's not working that. It would be very nice, but that's not the way things work, unfortunately, okay? So you have to go beyond that, okay? So now I want to go back to entry competition. I seem to say before, well, when you are close to frontier, when you are technologically advanced, you should liberalize entry, okay? But does it mean that you have a reduced role for the state? No, because you see, the way it works is like this. Here, I have drawn on the, now I have a laser, you see, so it's great. So this line, so this is done on UK firm-level data. So I take firms in the UK, but you can do the same taking firms in Italy, or firms in Russia, or firms in India, and I've done that for various countries, and we get always the same picture. So the blue line is the firms that are, so on the horizontal axis is the entry rate, is foreign entry. So when I am high, I have a high rate of foreign entry. When I'm low, I have a low rate of foreign entry, okay? And on the upper side is productivity growth, which is like innovation. And now the blue line is those firms that are initially technologically advanced. They have a high productivity to start with. And we see that when you liberalize entry, those firms, in fact, it stimulates productivity growth in those firms. So suppose I am a guy, I'm already doing well, and you liberalize entry on my market. I say, wow, I have to work harder to beat the entrant. But I am confident because I'm already a good guy. So I know if I work hard, I can beat the entry threat, okay? So I innovate to escape the entry threat. So those guys, you see, they react positively to entry. Entry is good for innovation in firms that are already doing well. Okay, but they know they have a chance to beat the entrant, to survive the entrant. But the red guy are the laggards, are those who are not very developed. And they say, God, if entry comes in, whatever I do, I will lose my profits. Why should I invest in innovation? Because anyway, whatever I do will be lost by entry, will be eaten up by entry. So those guys are discouraged. So you see, typically, those who are already doing well, it's like in a classroom. There's been studies on classrooms. When you put good people in a classroom, those who are already doing well are stimulated, and they work better. And those who are laggards, they do worse. Caroline Hawksby and others have done this kind of study. So exactly it works the same way with pupils as it works with firms. So you see that the entry may be good overall for growth, but it has different effects on the good people and those who are laggards. Some people benefit from entry, some people lose from entry. And now there is a question, what do you do with the workers? All those guys who decline, what do you do with the workers there? That's where you need the state. The state can help relocate the workers from the red firms to the blue firms, you see? And that's why you need a labor market policy to accompany the competition policy you are putting in place. And that's a very important role for the state that the state didn't have before, you see? You see how and that's a big problem we have in France. We want to put flex security like they did in Denmark. I know there will be a session on flex security. Pierre Cahuc will talk about that. Or you want to do something of that kind. It's exactly that problem. You want to be able to survive, you see, to say, well, I will liberalize product markets like taxi drivers and many markets that Prodi and Padoa Escobar are trying to liberalize, but you need a labor market policy to accompany that movement. Okay? Now that might be a difference between Berlusconi and Prodi. Prodi says, I need a labor market policy. Maybe Berlusconi says, I don't. Maybe the center-left in France says that we need it, and the right says we don't. We can have a debate on that. Okay? The Nordic view versus the Anglo-Saxon view. Okay, conclusion. We need to accompany competition policies by labor market policy to help relocate labor from declining to expanding sectors. So now you can take another example. It's education. So I told you, when we were, during the 30 years after World War II, we were in the business of catching up with the US, essentially. To imitate primary, secondary education is fine. In Italy, you have very good primary and secondary education. And so in France, although in France it's declining a bit, but it's okay. I mean, we have an okay primary, secondary. But if you go to a university in France, you are in the third world. It's terrible. It's poverty. It's misery. It's awful. I mean, just go there. You will see. It's all falling apart, you know. And so the question is that a big deal or not a big deal? Alors then, again, this is education. And here on the left-hand side, I have those countries who invest essentially in low education and not in high education. And those are those countries that invest more in high education. You see, when you invest in low education, and you are far below frontier, that's fine, no big deal. You see, those who invest more in low education or more in high education, they essentially grow at the same rate when they are far below frontier. But look now close to frontier. It's terrible when you invest in low education, whereas those who invest in high education, they do relatively well close to frontier. You see what I mean? So you have, again, like in the openness and the entry picture. When you are far below frontier, no big deal if you don't invest much in high education. But when you are close to frontier and you have to innovate, big deal not to invest in high education. And that's what Europe needs to do. And that's why we are having now the ERC in Brussels, the Bologna process. We are now realizing that things need to be done this way. Okay, and you can find that with the US as well. When you are close to frontier, you see growth benefits a lot from research education. When you are far from frontier, you want to invest. In Alabama, it's mainly in two-year colleges that you want to invest, you see? And that's exactly the same across US states as you find across countries. Now, we need, therefore, to invest more in higher education. That's the role of the state. Who invests more in higher education? Well, it has to be pushed by the state. In France, for example, Sarkozy should invest more in higher education. For the moment, he's busy giving money to, the inheritance tax being suppressed, to give things and that. But I hope at some point, he will put money where it should be put, which is to invest in higher education. Now, the other thing is, that's good, but what about the governance of universities? Is it enough to invest in higher education? And governance of universities, this is an interesting picture. Have you heard about Shanghai? The Shanghai ranking. You know, there has been a ranking last year by University of Shanghai of universities around the world based on publications, citations, Nobel Prizes, medals, whatever, okay? And France was very badly ranking. And I can tell you, Italy is also very bad, worse than France. You see? And now what's very interesting here is the sum of rank, proportion of sum of ranks. So it gives you a ranking. And and here you have population. So essentially, if you do a 45-degree line, those who are above the 45 degree are doing well. Those who are below the 45 degree are doing very bad. So France and Italy are really the very bad guys. Okay, we have very poor performance in terms of the Shanghai ranking compared to our population. And now the question is, what are the characteristics of the good performers? Who is doing well? Switzerland, Sweden, UK, all those guys are above the 45-degree lines. Okay, And of course, they have common points and they have differences. But now, what are the characteristics of good performers? Well, what you can show is that the good performers, they have a high budget per student. So when I say you have to spend more on higher education, you need money. But then you need other things, wage setting by the university, high wages, high rig is controlled by the university. So what you really, and low rigidity in wages, that means that people of the same age may earn very different salaries because one publishes more than the other, okay? Yeah, you would like to reward performance, not just age, okay? That's very important too. And so, in fact, what we realize is that those countries who do well are those who first invest a lot in higher education, but also give autonomy to the university. The big word there is autonomy. And so that universities can hire, can use the money they have to go on the market and compete for the good professors. And that's what, in fact, that's the basis of the whole system, of a good system of universities. So you need a combination between autonomy and money. The bad performers, more public, low budget per student, high endogamy, wage setting by the state, high rigidity in wage, and state approves the budget. And those are characteristics mostly of the bad performers. So what you get is that we need to invest more in higher education, but at the same time you increase the autonomy of universities. Doesn't mean that you privatize them, but you need more autonomy. So again, it's not less state, it's different state. The state should not be involved as much, as before. We set the wage, we control everything. We should not be control freaks, but at the same time, the state should very much be involved in setting up an incentive system and a competition system that in fact promotes excellence within the academic world, you see? And that's another, again, it's not less state, it's state differently, okay? So now, I'm almost done. How long do I have? I'm almost done.
Yes, 20 minutes.
Oh, I have another 20 minutes? Oh, I won't need 20 minutes. No, but we can go again, because maybe labor market flexibility is like a record, you see, I can... so labor market flexibility. So we said we can show that labor market flexibility is more growth enhancing for countries that are more technologically advanced, okay? Because you need innovation, and innovation requires entry, exit, turnover, and that requires labor market flexibility. You see, it's very important for a firm in innovative economy to be able to move to another market and be able to hire and fire very quickly. So you need labor market flexibility, okay? Now, the thing is that the state can help there by having a flex security. What did the Danish do? The Danish said, okay, firms can hire and fire freely, but when you fire a worker, the worker is paid 90% of his salary, so the state intervenes. The state provides, is at the head of a whole system of training. It's not necessarily done by the state, but the state is monitoring the training process. And then we propose new jobs, and if people refuse more than 2 new jobs, they lose the subsidies. Okay, so you have a system that responsibilizes everybody. But the state came as a broker. Without the state, you would not do it. The state is crucial to be a third party between the unions and the firms, you see? And the role of the state is more important than it was before. It's a role that did not exist before. And now it can take different forms, you see. Denmark is not Italy, those countries differ. But you need a role of the state. You can't say just the state steps out of this. The state has to be part of it to make it work, okay? And I think that's, again, a contention that I have. So now I want to finish up with macroeconomic policy. That's a very important issue because of the euro area, okay? So there is a big debate, and you might know about ECB, the European Central Bank, and the Stability and Growth Pact. And the picture is this. I always like to show that picture. That picture there, this is the variation in structural deficit over the years, and this is the variation of short-term interest rate. So this is like budgetary policy, and this is monetary policy. Here you have a recession. After 2000, we enter a recession. What do the US, this is the US. The US, what do they do in recession? They lower short-term interest rate, and they increase structural deficit a lot. The UK more or less do also the same with big swings. But the Eurozone, they do nothing. They don't move. They barely move. You see, if you're claustrophobic, don't look at this picture. This picture is terrible. We are not moving. We are like this, not moving at all, you see? And the question is that a big deal or not a big deal? And I want to argue that it is a big deal for an innovative economy. What is my reasoning there? Is that, in principle, recessions, you could say, are good for innovation. It's when you are in a recession that you question yourself and you say, I should innovate maybe. I should escape the recession by doing something else. You know, when in your life things don't go well, maybe that's when you start questioning what you should do in life. So a priori, you should think, well, recessions is not bad news. You can just decide to do something else. The problem is that if you want to do something else, is to invest elsewhere. And you need to invest, you need to borrow. Because you don't have the money, you need to borrow. When you are credit constrained, the problem is that it's very hard to borrow in recession. So recession are typically the periods where you would like to invest somewhere else, but because your cash flow is very low in recession, it's also the time where it's hardest to borrow, you see? So there you have a problem, is that typically when you have in economies with credit constraint, where firms are credit constrained, they suffer a lot from recessions and booms. You see, in recession, they cut their R&D typically. They cut their innovative investment. Whereas, in fact, they should be doing more of it in recessions, you see? And so the question is, well, what should the government do? Should the government just stay out? And the idea is that no, the government should in fact replace and do what the credit market cannot do. The credit market, I cannot lend you much as a creditor. Well, the state can come and provide a boost, to complete what the credit market cannot do. And that's the idea there, is to say, in fact, in particular, what I call counter-cyclical budgetary policy is the idea that the government spends more, particularly on investment in recessions, to boost the firms that need a boost, because otherwise, you see, the fact that they are credit constrained and they are in recession, can damage their R&D, their innovative investment. So what you do is that you say, well, I should have a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. The government should do more deficit in recession and then repay the deficit, reduce the deficit in an expansion phase, okay? Now, I will ask, here I want to show you a table, but this table, don't look at it. It just tells you that, this table just tells you that when you have pro-cyclical government investment or government deficit, it's very bad for growth, and that it's very good for growth to have counter-cyclical budget deficit, in fact. That's what this table is telling you, okay? But now, let's look at cross countries. You see, this is a very interesting picture that, again, a bit like we had before. That's over the years, the extent to which the budget deficit became more or less counter-cyclical. So this is the UK. You see, the UK has become much more counter-cyclical over the years. The US also a bit more counter-cyclical. But you see, the EMU zone, the EMU area, has not become more counter-cyclical, you see? We have remained, you see, we should become more counter-cyclical, and we don't. And that's a big problem. Now, how can you solve that problem? Well, there are various ways of doing it. For example, we need a government of a true euro government. There is something that's missing in Europe. You see, in England, they have the Bank of England and the Treasury, okay? And Mr. Gordon Brown speaks with Mr. Mervyn King, you see, and they respect each other. They don't spit at each other, they respect each other, and together they determine the inflation target, and they determine the macro policy together. It's a dialogue between the bank, which has independence in implementing the policy, but in defining the policy, it's done by the bank and the government. And in Europe, you don't have such things. You have the ECB, which is a free electron. They are on their own. There is nobody, there is no counterpart, there is no Gordon Brown in the Eurozone that can talk to the ECB and says, well, there is maybe something wrong with your exchange rate, or maybe we should rethink the inflation target, or there is no such thing. And the countries in the Eurozone have a big problem being counter-cyclical. In fact, they are pro-cyclical mainly. And so you could do various things like rainy day funds, or various things that could be done to restore the counter-cyclical fiscal policies, but all those require more coordination within the euro area, and they require a true government of the euro area. So I think will be certainly discussed over the years. I'm sure you will hear these discussions. That's one of the things Sarkozy wants to push, so when he does good things, I won't go against him. But that's it's a big debate there, is how to have a much more voluntarist an effective macroeconomic policy in Europe. So my general conclusion is that innovative economies do not require less state, but they require state differently, okay? You need to accompany competition policy by relocation policies to help workers relocate from lagging sectors to more advanced sectors. You need to invest in flex security so that people are willing to take risks because they know that mobility will not be at their own expense only, that the risks are shared equitably between firms and workers. You need to invest more in higher education because innovation requires higher education. You need to be more activist on macroeconomic policy because otherwise firms are discouraged to invest in R&D because they know that R&D investment will be badly hit in recessions unless the government steps in to help them. And you need also to rethink industrial policy. You can't be, as before, all top-down. You cannot also be all bottom-up. Some areas like, you know, Airbus or some big investment that require coordination may still require some top-down policy. Or, for example, global warming. Those are areas where top-down is important, where government role is important. But in others, you should have more a bottom-up policy. So it's a new way of thinking about government intervention in the industrial sphere. And finally, there is a whole question of agenda setting of reforms. Alors that's another debate we have in France. What should you be doing first? And, or which kind of reform should you do together? I think there is now a whole thinking to do when about you want to implement innovation-enhancing reforms, how you do your agenda setting, given that you have a budget constraint, given that reforms are costly and you cannot spend in everything at the same time. On the other hand, some reforms are more effective if done jointly than if done sequentially. So that you know, there is a whole set of questions about agenda setting. And that concludes what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Bene, grazie professor AGHION per questo appassionato intervento.
Thank you very much, Professor AGHION, for speaking also so passionately. We have time now for questions and answers. We have no time constraint in this case. So I open the floor to questions, if any, or comments. Do you have any comment on the observations made by Professor AGHION? I would say that I absolutely agree with what he said, and I would like to express to him my solidarity because his party has lost in France. We won in Italy, and yet we are not satisfied either, you see. So, well, I can start with a remark or a question about the new role that you attribute to the state in function of development and innovation of a country. Well, in relation to that, could you provide us with some practical example that you could express in terms of its positive aspect? Could you mention perhaps one European country which has been particularly proactive in terms of innovation, using the state not in as a sort of guarantor of the past, but with this new role that you mentioned?
Well, you know, I have the feeling that, for example, some Nordic countries, I mean, I know that Sweden is undergoing other reforms, but I think several countries, Scandinavian countries, for example, Denmark in particular, or Finland, I think are interesting examples where they have tried, you see, to promote innovation, to push very much, and they've done, you know, they moved into mobile phones, into internet, into, you know, the ITC revolution, but in a way that was facilitated, I think, by the flex security, you see, concern. And so for me, you know, that we have to learn, there are things to learn. It's not that we can transpose, you see, there are differences, so it's not that we can copy, because, and I think Pierre Cahuc will argue that there are differences, you know, in terms of trust and norms between France and Denmark that makes the Danish system not immediately transposable to France, for example. But I still need that so it shows that you can combine the two. And so I think we have to learn from their example.
Thank you. Professor Spaventa. Forse in italiano così si possono tradurre e sentire tutti.
Should be asked in Italian and don't translate it into English. Unfortunately, using a microphone, unless the gentleman uses a microphone, no translation is possible. Thank you. And you should speak into the microphone. We cannot hear him at all. An article with Acemoro and Tiribotti is what I read, and there an explanation was provided in relation to the state intervention being needed when you are far from the frontier, and then a situation being different when you're close to the frontier. So the question is, how can we reconcile what you said today and with the article? And then the second question is the following. Philippe, do you think that today we could be at the beginning of a new period of catch-up for European economies, which have basically wasted 8 or 10 years in missing the opportunity to absorb or catch up with the technology level acquired by the US, but now we indeed can catch up also because the productivity growth in the US perhaps has reached a limit, and after Walmart, unless we go back to the previous situation, what can we do?
Yeah, you refer to my paper with Acemoglu and Zilibotti, the distance to frontier paper. There, the point we were trying to make was that, for example, we were taking the example of competition policy, saying first that competition can be good close to frontier, but not necessarily good far from frontier. It was kind of infant industry argument we were fleshing out there. And we said then there is a problem, is the transition. There are some institutions that are good when you are far from the frontier, when you are not very developed, cease to be good when you become close. Should you put in place the ones that are good far below frontier and cease to be good when you are close, if you know that it may be difficult to change? For example, shouldn't Europe have right away from the Second World War onwards have very liberal policies so that we would not have the problem of transition? Because maybe we would not have grown as fast during the 30 years after the war, but we would not be now stuck into the problem of having to change our institutions. And that's a big debate there that Schleifer, Stiglitz, and others have been part of, okay? And which raises this problem of transition. But that was the problem we were raising there. We were not saying that competition is not good, close, and with that, on that was exactly conform to this. We were raising in that paper the problem of the transition, is that given that transitions may be difficult, shouldn't you have a kind of Washington consensus, which is to say liberalize always? Maybe it's not always good, but then you avoid the transition problems. And that's a huge debate. And I think still there is a case to be made against the pure Washington consensus view, but that was the big question raised there. And we can maybe have more discussions on that.
Grazie, Professor AGHION. C'è qualcun altro?
Mr. AGHION, anybody else wishing to take the floor or ask questions?
Philippe, I noticed in the first part of your talk you had a lot of models and a lot of graphs, but as soon as you got to talking about the funding of universities, the data and the graphs disappeared, and so did most of the theory. And I'm a little bit suspicious of your recommendation that the big secret in improving universities is to pay people more. Because I don't really understand where the accountability and the competitive forces are going to come from in a system that will, in the end, still be essentially state-controlled. In the UK, there's been a huge increase in spending on doctors. UK doctors are now some of the best-paid doctors in the world, but their productivity hasn't changed a bit because they're essentially not accountable.
Okay, Stephen. Well, in fact, I didn't show, well, I show one graph on the higher education, but because I didn't want to get too technical, but in fact, of all the things, it's probably the one I've worked most on for the past 6 years. With the work with Caroline Hoxby, which you will be in London. I'm giving the Gorman lectures next week on that subject for 2 days at UCL, so and I could show you. It's been, in fact, work where we regress growth on higher education, lower education, and whether or not states are close to frontier, like California or Massachusetts, or far below frontier, like Alabama. And those are regressions where we use political economy instruments, so we can really instrument for education spending, which could never be done in cross-country regression. So in fact, we can really instrument, and we see wherever we do that closer to frontier, more spending in higher education is growth enhancing. That's a constant. And the other thing we see, and we did that both on I showed the picture on the European thing, but we did regressions on US public universities. And what we show there is that there is what we call is a jargon, an interaction term, which is positive and significant between money and autonomy. When you give more money and the public university in the US is more autonomous, the effect of giving money on growth or on publications is much bigger. So there is clearly, so it's very interesting because we see that in the pictures, but the analysis, the descriptive analysis we did for European universities is confirmed by the more rigorous regressions we did using just university data, that autonomy and money goes hand in hand, in fact. It's the combination, the winning combination is that one. And those are very well instrumented. The US regressions are, I think you will see them if you come to the Gorman. But I think they were all to the merit of Caroline Hawksby, so I'm not, they are, I think, serious regressions. And they confirm what you already see, in a more impressionistic way, looking at the European data. That's what's interesting, is the combination of the money and the governance, which works well, actually.
Avevamo forse un'altra domanda qui in questa zona?
Any other questions here, please? May I be allowed to go back to the example of Finland and address some details? Well, the Finnish case has very much in common with Nokia, as you know. This is a large firm in a small country which has become an international leader in the telephone sector, but I don't believe that the role of economic policy is particularly clear here. If we want to study the reasons which led Finland to becoming the country it is today, we could talk about investments in research and development or investments in education, but a fundamental element in the history of Finland goes back to the 19th century, and in particular to the relationship of Finland to Russia. And of course the idea was that of leading Finland to detach itself from the state. On the one hand, there was the habit on the part of the state to provide useful services to firms, which was absolutely not the norm in the rest of Europe or in the rest of the world, because the telephony sector was absolutely free there. Well, and the result has been that a market has ensued much earlier than elsewhere. Well, this habit has been a substantial component for the success of Nokia, and this explains why the Finns are particularly good in the telecom sector. Well, this hasn't very much to do with economic policy supporting innovation. We could conclude that what happened in Finland is something which cannot be easily transferred to other countries. There was a high recession in Finland, and the existing firms were eliminated, and as a consequence, the Nokia managers were encouraged to bring about a real revolution. To which extent can the Finnish case be replicated?
But Finland, I don't want to concentrate only on Finland, but I think there is something interesting to say about Finland as well, is that here is the example of Finland with an economy that went through a big crisis, and which was the 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union, and there was a back against the wall effect, and that forced this economy to reform, and it didn't do it in the same way as the UK did it with Thatcher. So I think that's something interesting. And one of the aspects, by the way, of the Eurozone is that with policies which were not very reactive macroeconomic, we did not help reform so much, but also we had a kind of anesthetic effect of the Eurozone. I believe that there is a kind of anesthetic effect. You don't perceive the crisis as sharply as you would if you see your own currency falling, as we did in France, in '83, where we realized we had to change things. So I think that Finland is an interesting case of a country that found itself against the wall, okay, and then reacted in a way which was not identical to UK, because it preserved its social model more, and still implemented very big structural reforms, but still while preserving a certain number of social conquest. I think there is this Sapir article that he did after the report, where he said, in fact, if you have two kinds of countries, you have three kinds of countries, essentially. You have two kinds that reform and do well, UK and the Nordic, okay? And then you have the continental, where we are, okay? And so the continental, the UK, they have high growth, but high inequality and a number of social costs, okay? The Nordic, they managed to grow fast, to reform, and to reduce those costs. And the continental, they did none. I mean, they did not reform, they didn't do the structural reform, they are not growing fast, but they maintained relative equality. And he said, well, you could go from the continental, instead of going through the UK model, you could go through the Nordic model. Of course, well, I mentioned Finland before, but I think of Denmark, I think of, I mean, the idea that you can do structural reforms at a lower social cost than it is in the UK. And I think he makes a convincing point that the social cost was lower in terms of inequality, in terms of, in the Nordic countries than it was in the UK, which shows that there is not only one way of reforming, there are several ways. And in fact, what we see in the debate in France or in Italy is precisely that. Everybody agrees we should reform, but we don't agree on whether we should follow the UK way, the Thatcherian way, or a more Nordic approach. And I think that's what I was trying to convey. But it's true that Finland has its own peculiarities, but they reconcile. What's interesting, it's interesting, the Finland or the Nordic, because Prescott goes around, and Prescott or Lucas says, the big thing to grow fast in Europe is lower tax. Okay? That's the thing. And in fact, this is rubbish. It's not true. Some countries have not lowered tax so much, and they manage to do it very well. Other countries have decided to lower tax. But the key things are the structural reforms, not the fact that you lower tax or not. That's what I was after when I mentioned the Nordic versus the UK.
Grazie, professor Aghion. Altre domande? Abbiamo ancora tempo.
Other questions, ladies and gentlemen? We still have some time. Good afternoon. Just two questions on my part. Well, they refer to the university system. Well, the first question is the following. What is the best university model according to you? We have the US model or the British model with a lot of investments and very few research centers, very few famous universities, whereas the Italian system is marked by the presence of many universities widespread on the territory, which offers the possibility to many people to have access to university, even though the same people don't have easy access to the market, to the labor market. The second question refers to China. You know that China used to be quite far away from frontier until some years ago, and as a result of a series of economic policies, it has greatly developed in recent years. This means that they will have to change their approach to the university system. But do you think that there's going to be an impact also in terms of social policies?
Well, it's a long question. I wanted to tell you something. It's very interesting. When we looked at this European survey that I was mentioning, in fact, in Britain, they spend less. I mean, there is less spending, but they gave autonomy, okay? And so what you see in the UK is high mean, high variance. You see some universities are doing very, very well, and a number of others who are doing poorly, okay? That's what you get because you have little money to spend, and it goes to some places, and others with the research assessment exercise or the various schemes, but others do very poorly. Switzerland invests more, and Switzerland, even though it's more state-managed system, Switzerland, they have high mean, high variance, low variance. So in Switzerland, you have high mean, but also many universities do relatively well, you see? But they put more money into the system as well. So again, when you look at universities, you have a bit like the Sapir paper that I was mentioning before. You could go the UK way, say, I don't spend more, I just give autonomy, more autonomy, and then I have the variance, but I have a higher mean, but a high variance, or I could decide I spend more into the system so that I preserve the relative equalities. That maybe they will have more inequality among universities, but still the Gini will be under control, and still but the average level, the mean level will go up, because in Italy and France we have a dramatic problem that we need to increase the mean. You see, we need to enter the Shanghai ranking much better than we have so far. And there again, you have the two ways of doing it, you see. And that you see that from the data, well, you see that from the analysis.
C'è una domanda qui davanti.
Here in the front.
Stream of like the developed countries, but I would like to know what's the role of like the BRIC, especially Brazil, Russia, India, and China, in innovation and technology. It's a rather vague question, but I would like to know your personal opinion about that.
So it's very interesting is that how you design growth-enhancing policy, and it's true, they have to also take into account that you have an ICT revolution, or that you have, and Brazil should enter. So what should they do differently? I think Brazil, typically in a number of those countries, I know if I've seen with Brazil, I know South Africa a bit better because I've been working in South Africa. The big problem in South Africa is lack of competition, and apparently in Brazil, you have a problem of lack of competition. You should open up more than they have. Brazil has a problem that they invest too much in higher education compared with lower education. But that comes from the high level of inequality in that country. Is that, in fact, essentially the system was, in fact, designed by the rich for the rich. So that there you had kind of, most of the spending was in higher education. But it reflects, it was not adequate to their level of development, but that came from exactly that political economy problem. Sorry? Alors, India and China. Alors, India is very interesting because India has gone through a big structural reforms in the mid-80s and in the early 90s. And what they did is to liberalize trade and entry, which I was mentioning before. But again, you can see there that it was very good for firms that were doing well, but very bad for those who were laggards. Also, what you can see is that it worked very well in states where you had already labor market flexibility. But you have some states of India where you have more labor market rigidity, and there it didn't work so well. So that's very interesting that the same reform not only may work differently for firms that are more advanced or firms that are less advanced, but also in states that have different type of what I would call slow-moving institutions. So the Indian case is very interesting on its own. I've done a lot of work on one paper on India, again, with this view that you have to adapt the policy to the environment, you see, be it technological development, financial development, or the labor market institutions that you have in the state.
Grazie, professor AGHION. Forse là in fondo abbiamo un'altra osservazione?
Other questions, please? Or remarks?
I have a very precise question. Suppose you create a euro area. Let's get back to the macro policy. Suppose you create a euro area political government. What policy levers does it have now, and what ones would you give it in order that it could achieve anything except shouting at the European Central Bank to change its policies?
Well, I mean, we are working, we have a, I know in the Bruegel thing, we are working with Jean Pisani and a group around him and Sapir and others on thinking about that. So we are in the middle of it, so I could not give you a definite answer. But things, for example, we had in my various examples, you know what would be helpful? There is something called rainy day funds. You know what rainy day funds are? Those are funds by countries that you put aside money in good times to use in bad times. But now, for a country individually to do that is very hard, because it's very hard to say that it's a money that could not be claimed. If you do it with a third party, like the Euro government, you can do it much more easily. That's an easy one. Another thing that you could do with the Euro government is to tell a country that does structural reforms, okay, you do structural reform, flex security, that's costly. That will force you maybe to go beyond the 3% deficit. You know, the deficit will be, or your debt ratio will be higher than what the Stability and Growth Pact says. Well, because you are doing the structural reform, we may allow you to borrow, to take an advance on this that you might reimburse later, when you, using the growth that you generate with this structural reform. Another thing is to maybe the euro area could become a zone of labor market mobility, that you could transfer pensions, for example, within the euro area more easily. It would be very hard to do right away within the 26 EU countries, but maybe within the euro area you could do that more easily. Another thing is that, for example, discussing exchange rates. You know, suppose now the dollar or the yen are in crazy levels. Who can discuss with those guys? Who can represent the Eurozone to talk? Nobody. Nobody can talk to China, or nobody can talk. That's what the president of a Eurozone with power could do, you see. And those are the kind of things we think are important. But those are kind of ideas we are fleshing out that, you know, should be attributions, besides being a partner to the ECB, exactly like Gordon Brown is a partner to Mervyn King.
Grazie, professor AGHION. Abbiamo un'altra domanda, forse qui in mezzo.
Question here.
Grazie.
Prego.
Io vorrei spostarmi un po' dal...
I would like to move a bit away from the scientific level and ask a couple of questions which are more general, perhaps. And then you can also take your time in providing me with an answer. I'm not in a hurry, you see. My first question is, well, listening to you in relation to your proposal about a continuous flexibility when it comes to the behavior of the state, and also in relation to the policy for training of labor and the social welfare system. So thinking about all these things, I actually come to think of two problems. First of all, the size, because if you bring as a model Sweden or Nordic countries, then really there we have relatively small countries which are very cohesive, so to say, and it is easier there to implement the reforms that you said. And it is more difficult to do the same in a country which is much bigger, where there are many regions, where population is much more numerous, and so problems vary a lot. So my first question is, what social costs do you pay in the moment when you go for these continuous variations? Indeed, today we have, for instance, a generation of young people who have a problem of identity because they really don't know what they will do tomorrow. So if we have this continuous change in the role of the state, what about the impact of that? And then when I listen to very scientific and specialized talk, so to say, I always come to think of the problem of sustainability, environmental sustainability. What about the cost of all this in terms of environmental sustainability? The financial world and the state, well, in relation again, to sustainability, how do the two things relate? So, and this, of course, leads us back to the social aspect. I think that this is a fundamental issue, and I think that it was missing a bit from what you said, and this is a concern for me. Thank you.
I can't do justice to all the whole overall question. But I will try to for example, France today. Okay, so it's true that compared to Denmark, they have big unions. Most people are unionized. I think unionization is, I think, compulsory. And there you have essentially one big union. In France, you have several unions, and the rate of unionization in France is very low, although the coverage rate is very high. Okay, so it's true we need to move in France towards, and I think there on this Sarkozy and Royal agreed that we need to increase the rate of unionization in France to really have the elements of a social dialogue. So I think we need to go in that direction. So a big problem in France is the low rate of unionization. People are afraid of being members of union. So there are things you can do to deal with that problem. But for example, before even you do that, in France we have employment agencies which are a mess because it was one for looking for employment and one to give subsidies. And you should have the same agency. I should say, you know, the employment, I look for the employment for you, and I give you the subsidy if you behave in a certain way. So we need to reorganize our employment agencies in France. And also because in France, you have one agent for 140 unemployed. So you have one civil servant in charge of 140 unemployed. So they have no time to devote to them. In Denmark, you have one for 40 So you see, it's much easier for someone who works in an employment agency in Denmark to look after his unemployed because there are much less of them. So we need to spend more. That's spending. We need to spend. So once we will have people who follow the people, say, you should go, I advise you to do this, I advise you to do that, I follow your training, then trust is coming in. You see what I mean? And then a lot of things become possible. But for that, you need to spend money. And that's where I was mentioning the structural reforms before. You need first to be very parsimonious with how you spend your money. Money should be spent not for inheritance, to suppress inheritance tax like Sarkozy wants to do. Money should be spent on financing precisely this kind of reform, which are very costly. You see? And that's what maybe the Eurozone government also could help and say, well, you need to spend 70 billion euros to set up these new agencies with this. Well, we help you do that, okay? And then you reimburse me later on. So that's what I thought, you see, what the kind of thing I was bringing. Then on the environment, you see, the thing is the following. Before what we call endogenous growth theory, before this view that growth comes from innovation, people had the view that growth was coming from capital accumulation. And they had the view that growth could never be sustained because at some moment, accumulating capital is exhausting natural resources. And at some moment, we have to stop exhausting natural resources and we will stop growing. So there was very much this view that we would hit the zero growth. You see what I mean? That we have to learn to not grow at all. But now, since we know that innovation is a big engine of growth, it changes everything because with innovation, you can escape the resource constraint. Yes, because you can find new sources of energy. You can find ways of saving more and more on the energy that you have. And in fact, when you look at the effect of the oil shock, there have been empirical studies that show that countries that didn't have oil managed to grow even at least as fast as those who did, because they had to innovate more. It was an incentive for them to innovate. There have been studies, you see, that show that those who didn't have the oil, it was a blessing for them, because they had to escape the oil shock by innovating. And that, I think, opens up a lot. And now the whole thing is how you try to direct the innovation in the right direction in things that, make the growth sustainable. And that's where the debate is now, is how you can direct the innovation. But that, I think, is a fascinating avenue for thinking and research. And I think it will pay out.
Grazie, Professor Aghion. Abbiamo altri interventi?
Much, Professor Aghion. Is there any other request for the floor?
Not at all. Qualcun altro?
Absolutely not.
C'è ancora un'ultima domanda, ecco. Forse possiamo. Just one more.
Additional question, actually, or request for the floor. My question is not a technical one, and is the following. If we consider, for instance, the situation of Alitalia today, so my question is, the state intervention with companies or businesses such as this one, which is on the verge of bankruptcy, is it useful or not? Do you think that it is useful for the state to intervene in such a case, or should the state simply let the company go bankrupt?
In my area of expertise, but I think there are examples sometimes where, because you have imperfect credit markets, where having state intervention for a while, for example, putting more state capital in some firms that have big role, that have big externalities on the rest of the economy, can be warranted. You see, for example, Alstom in France, the government decided to put money to make Alstom survive. And then Alstom, but I think that there is a way of thinking, it's like my counter-cyclical policy. You see, when I said when you have a recession, the state can help. One way the state can help sometimes is to take participations in firms during recessions, but then when things go well again, the state can withdraw. You see what I mean? So it's a way. Now, of course, the problem is you go to a top-down policies, how you pick the winners. And that's always very dangerous because you may not pick the right firms to support or not to support. But I think that when you have firms that have large fixed costs, big externalities on the rest of the economy, then there are situations, you see, those are cases where there may be a case for government. Like, for example, Airbus now. Should we let Airbus not just like this, or should governments intervene to keep Airbus alive? And I think it has importance to keep Airbus alive. Or some strategic sectors that you want to keep alive. So now the whole question, and that's the more general question you ask, is how you now design industrial policy. You cannot be top-down on everything. You have to be top-down selectively and bottom-up on the rest. How you select, that's the question. But on the idea that in some selected sectors or cases, the state in recession could step in to help the firm survive at that time and then withdraw, I think that's an idea which I think works, I think, and I think it makes sense. You see, you cannot just have a laissez-faire attitude, say whatever happens, I'm out. Now the question is, should you be out by taking capital participation, or like with Boeing and the US government, through just saying, I have, orders, public orders. Is public orders enough, or you need to go further? And that's a question I'm not capable of answering here.
Qualcun altro?
Volevo chiedere se
My question is, well, renewal, can it also be extended to international organizations such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund? And then perhaps the mistake in development policies for countries, and I know a lot about Ethiopia and Eritrea, so the mistake I was saying lied in the fact that oftentimes we could not shift from imitation to innovation. So perhaps international policies did not manage to go from one level to the other, from the level coming before the frontier and the one after the frontier. So that was the question.
I think, well, it's a very difficult, the role of international organizations is that's not something there is clearly a crisis these days, that IMF, it's not clear what role IMF plays these days. And also what role the World Bank plays, and should it be adapted to the new conditions, the new era? Now you have a lot of private actors. Now you have countries like Venezuela who want to bypass the World Bank. Now you have NGOs also that bypass or work in complementarity. And I think there is a big issue now of identity for IMF and World Bank. I mean, they have to redefine their role. I think it's, and I think that's a huge question. Things that the World Bank did recently, which was good, was to help microfinance. The World Bank intervened to help microfinance institutions. So there was a kind of complementarity. It's like a co-financing between the World Bank and the private, you see, for microfinance institutions. That I think is an area where the World Bank has been, with others, like with the Inter-American Development Bank, more successful. But they have to rethink how they operate, because there was first the model, the McNamara model, which was very top-down and failed, and there was Anne Kruger saying, well, you should be very liberal, but it's not that they have imposed an alternative model, you see what I mean? And you have this big crisis of identity now.
C'era un'altra domanda?
There is another question. When it comes to counter-cyclical financing to businesses, and then you spoke about funding to universities. Well, this situation, how can it be applied to Italy in a situation when we have, in general, medium and small-sized enterprises, and in a country where we have a deficit exceeding 100% in the relation to the GDP, so the state budget is always very, very poor?
It's a big, that's a good question. Or maybe there are a number of things that can be done probably to deal with the budget problem. But I think that's an area where, I was mentioning that maybe the Euro government could help countries. For example, they say, I invest in, certain kind of investment which are structural. I include higher education as one of those. Then maybe some facilities could be provided, you see, for that purpose. But it has to be on a transitional basis. And it has to be, say, if you don't repay, you have, of course, to pay more. It's like interest rate. And if you don't repay at the time you have to repay, you pay more. so that you put the country on a hard budget constraint somehow. And maybe there are things that could be thought also that allows countries like Italy to spend more and reorganize more. So, for example, if Italy says, I come up with an autonomy plan for universities, it's not just that I give more money, but I come up with a plan to reorganize completely the university system, well, then it's something that, the Euro government could say, well, because you are using this money to reorganize the system, that's something that we might consider, you see, and we might help. But if you just say, I want to spend more on universities without changing, that's typically something that, there is no It's not clear that, which one should provide you with facilities just to give more money. It should be budget against growth, not budget against nothing.
Prego.
No, ma intendevo dire anche e soprattutto il fatto...
I was simply referring to the fact that the Italian structure is mainly based on small and medium-sized enterprises. Will these enterprises be in a position to innovate? I do believe that they need, for example, new graduates. Do you think that they will be in a position to react accordingly?
It's more I've looked a bit at what inhibits entry and growth of small and medium-sized firms in Europe. And the main factor that comes in, so one aspect is labor market flexibility, but the main factor is credit. In fact, the main reason why enterprises don't grow and don't innovate enough in Europe is because they lack credit. So is it because the banking system is not sufficiently competitive? Is it because bankruptcy laws are not good enough and you don't have enough creditor rights and therefore creditors are not willing to take risks? Is it because you don't have enough co-financing by venture capitalists and business angels? But there is a lot there that, you see, a big source, that the main probably factor that inhibits private sector growth and innovation by small and medium-sized enterprises is credit, is the reform on the credit market. And there are various, and that's not something we understand very well. We know that credit is important, and we don't know exactly, is it bank concentration, is it bankruptcy law, is it the lack of venture capital? We don't yet understand exactly what are the main sources that make the credit sector an inhibiting force for new investment, for new innovative investment. And that's a big sector that's very much, has been overlooked. You see, for example, the Sapir report or other reports have not said much on the finance. We've said a lot on the labor market and product market, but very little on the credit market. And I think that needs to receive much more attention.
Bene. Grazie professor AGHION, penso che possiamo concludere.
Very much, Professor AGHION. I think that we may conclude here. May I be allowed to thank the organizers of this festival for providing us with this valuable opportunity.